I invite the honourable members for Carleton and South Surrey White Rock to rise and make brief interventions. The honourable member from Carleton.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today on a matter of grave, urgent, and time-sensitive importance. Your decision on whether to grant this emergency debate will be a life or death decision. And if you question that, let me share with you the statistics and the background. In May of 2022, the Prime Minister announced that he was granting the British Columbia NDP government an exemption to the criminal code prohibition on crack, heroin, meth, and other deadly drugs. In January of the following year, 2023, that exemption took effect, which decriminalized those aforementioned drugs and their use in playgrounds, hospitals, parks, transit, and other places where children and vulnerable people are exposed to the risks. The results are now in, and they are irrefutable. In the 12 months that followed the decriminalization of these hard drugs, British Columbia had a record-smashing 2,500 drug overdose deaths. This represents a 380% increase in said deaths since the Prime Minister took office. In other words, in the period since these policies came into effect, we've seen drug overdose deaths increase by a factor of 4. Furthermore, Canada is now the fastest growing, has the fastest growing drug overdose death rate and the second highest total rate of any of the 11 countries reviewed by the Commonwealth Fund. In other words, people are dying as a direct result of these policies. This is not simply my claim, it is now the NDP government's admission. As I said at the outset, it was the NDP government that asked for the decriminalization that the Prime Minister granted. That provincial government has now reversed itself and has asked for the government to urgently recriminalize drugs in many public places, an admission that this policy is taking lives. Mr. Speaker, this is where the urgency comes. Every day in British Columbia, 6 people die of drug overdoses. This is by far the highest overdose rate anywhere in Canada, something that even the NDP government is now attributing, in part, to the decriminalization. Unfortunately, that government needs the federal government's permission to reimpose criminal sanctions on those drugs, something that the minister refused to grant today, which means that even though the NDP government in BC wants to recriminalize, as I stand here and as the clock ticks, decriminalization is in place. Every single day that goes by before the Prime Minister reverses himself, decriminalized drugs will be killing people on the streets of Vancouver, on Vancouver Island, in the Lower Mainland, and in other places across the province.
I ask the honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby please to hold his comments until he has the floor. The honourable member from Carleton has the floor.
Anyone who does not believe 6 deaths per day is not an emergency needs to give their head a shake. Anybody who says that 2,500 deaths a year is not an emergency needs to give their head a shake. These numbers, by the way, Mr. Speaker, do not include the indirect deaths that are caused by drug-induced crime on innocent bystanders who might just be taking their kids to a local Starbucks before they get stabbed in front of their family and die in a puddle of their own blood, to be broadcast on social media, as we've seen. Those are the kinds of horrific scenes that have become commonplace ever since this Prime Minister and the NDP radical policy was implemented. So, given that we're losing 6 lives a day, given that the reversal of the policy could prevent some of those lost lives, or at the very least, such a matter should be debated, and given that the clock is ticking as the NDP government in BC awaits a decision from this Prime Minister and his Health Minister, this is an emergency. And we ask you to join with common sense Conservatives to allow for this debate to happen immediately so that we can stop the drugs, disorder, death, and destruction that the radical NDP Liberal decriminalization policy has caused. Thank you.
The honourable member from South Surrey, White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I also rise to request an emergency debate on the Prime Minister's dangerous and failed drug decriminalization policy. You heard the Leader of the Opposition speak about the gravity, that it is a grave and urgent matter, and I agree with that. I particularly agree with it as a British Columbian. BC Premier David Eby and his NDP government have finally admitted that these extremist policies are a failure. And now he's come begging for major changes to the Prime Minister's hard drug decriminalization plan. For Canadians watching who are not from BC, this plan allows for opioids, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines to be used in public spaces, such as parks, coffee shops, your local Tim Hortons, public transit, and even hospitals. When this policy began in 2023, the province set a devastating record. In that 1 year, there were over 2,500 drug deaths. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more than 40,000 Canadians have tragically died from drug overdoses. 40,000 completely preventable deaths. Taxpayer-funded drugs continue to be handed out by this radical government, and these deadly drugs are increasingly diverted into the hands of organized crime and teenagers, pushing our youth into the destructive cycle of addiction. We see videos about this pretty much daily out of British Columbia. Drug overdose is now the #1 cause of death for 10 to 17-year-olds in BC. That's pretty devastating, Mr. Speaker. Until the Prime Minister's extremist drug decriminalization policy is dismantled, it will continue to cause death, chaos, and carnage across Canada. Parliament has a responsibility to attend to the ongoing destruction caused by this deadly hard drug policy. I understood from the Minister earlier today in question period that they have Premier Eby's request under review. Well, as the Leader of the Opposition just said, every day of review means 6 more deaths. Every day. I trust that my request will be considered as the emergency and crisis that it is, in order to save lives, rebuild families, eliminate chaos in our streets, and start putting more money into treatment and recovery from drug addiction. We must put an end to these dangerous and deadly policies immediately. I repeat, Mr. Speaker, 6 lives per day, every day. The time to turn this hurt into hope starts now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please consider this as the urgent matter it is. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the honourable member from South Surrey, White Rock, as well as the member from Carleton for giving the Speaker notice, as well as for their arguments that they're presented here in the House. However, I do find that their request does not meet the requirements of the standing order as it is listed in the House of Commons standing orders. Orders of the day. The honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby is rising on a point of order.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I believe the tables received notice. And I did mention prior to our break, when we went back to our constituencies, that I would be intervening on the issue and the use of false titles in the House of Commons. You'll recall that this came up just prior to the constituency break. I did say at that time that I would be bringing forward further information. So I'm rising today. It will take a number of minutes to complete the